Josef Pjoz barely recovered from the violent impact. Sitting at the controls of the plane, he suddenly noticed something begin to dissolve his protective suit, eating away at his skin and then the muscles in his arm. Josef screamed in agony, but nothing could save the pilot. His aircraft had become a death trap. The plane in question was the Messerschmitt Me 163B Comet, a revolutionary design by Nazi Germany during World War II. This rocket-powered fighter was infamous for claiming the lives of its own pilots. But what made it so deadly? As always, viewer discretion is advised. 1943. The commander of a German test squadron and a former gliding champion, Wolfgang Späth, was the first to test the serial model of the Messerschmitt Me 163B Comet. As an expert in his field, he felt the gaze of admiration from developers and military officers of the Third Reich who gathered to witness this historic flight. He was already the hero in their eyes. The Comet was no ordinary interceptor. Developed under the guidance of aviation engineer Alexander Lippisch and the German Research Institute for Gliding, work on the Comet had begun as early as 1937. Together, their efforts created a true feat of engineering ambition. The Comet was the world's only operational rocket-powered fighter aircraft. Its innovative rocket engine made it the fastest plane of its time. It was also incredibly compact. The Me 163B had a wingspan of just 9 meters and a length of less than 6 meters, allowing for superior maneuverability. By 1941, the first prototype had taken flight, breaking records with speeds exceeding 1,000 kilometers per hour. For comparison, the Heinkel HE-100, its closest competitor, lagged by 250 kilometers per hour. The Comet was designed to intercept enemy bombers, but it struck fear into both its enemies and its own crew. Why? Its cutting-edge design, which made the aircraft super fast, was also its fatal flaw. The reason was the rocket propulsion system. The Comet's fuel tanks were placed directly behind the pilot's cockpit, a dangerous departure from traditional designs. Typically, fighter aircraft stored fuel in the fuselage, or wings, far from the pilot, to reduce the risk of fire or explosions. But the developers were so eager to make the Comet as mobile as possible that they neglected such safety measures. This was even though this fighter's fuel was even more dangerous than that of any other aircraft. It was powered by liquid T-Stoff, which was based on concentrated hydrogen peroxide and served as an oxidizer. When mixed with C-Stoff, a methanol and hydrazine-based compound, it triggered a chemical reaction that generated enough thrust to launch a small rocket. German engineers placed these volatile substances in separate tanks divided by only a thin barrier. This space-saving decision increased the risk of explosions. T-Stoff could also cause severe burns on contact, making fueling operations perilous. Ground crews worked cautiously, knowing that a single mistake could be fatal. Despite its dangers, the unique rocket fuel enabled the Comet to achieve incredible performance. It could climb to nearly 5,000 meters per minute, a revolution in military aviation. However, this rapid ascent caused severe pressure changes, leaving pilots of the Me 163B struggling with painful decompression sickness. In short, I realized one thing. The developers were only interested in the result, and they didn't even consider that the benefits of their invention came at the expense of pilot safety. The Comet was not for the faint of heart. Its operational flight time was a mere 7.5 minutes, giving pilots only a narrow window to intercept targets. Armed with 2 Mk-108 cannons, it posed a deadly threat to Allied bombers, but could only engage enemies within an 80-kilometer radius. On his maiden flight, Wolfgang Späth climbed into the cockpit and powered up the engine. As the Comet roared to life, Späth muttered, "Now I was about to find out what the Walter engine and my little Me 163 actually had in them." The Comet soared into the sky, climbing to 12,000 meters in just 3.5 minutes. The experienced pilot was impressed, but disaster struck. During takeoff, a fuel line had ruptured, the engine lost power, and the plane began to tilt. Späth quickly ejected, deploying his parachute. From above, he watched the Comet crash and explode in a fiery wreck. Smoke and debris scattered across the field. Shaken, Späth couldn't believe such an unreliable machine was being prepared for combat. His fears were validated as the Comet began claiming lives before it even reached the battlefield. In October 1942, Hanno Reitsch, a fearless German test pilot, took the Me 163 on one of its early test flights. Though pilots feared the Comet, Test flights were considered a prestigious assignment reserved for elite aviators. Hana, thrilled by the opportunity, eagerly stepped into the cockpit for her 5th flight, describing her first experience as like riding a cannonball. Hana was thrilled, but the second attempt was less exciting, as problems emerged right after takeoff. The plane required towing by another aircraft to reach altitude. However, when Hana tried to release the tow cable, nothing happened. Even worse, her radio wasn't working, leaving her unable to report the malfunction. Ground crews noticed the issue, yet assumed that Hana didn't. So the crew started firing signal flares, while a crew member on the tow plane frantically waved his arms. Meanwhile, the Comet's landing gear also failed. Hana was forced to attempt a precarious landing. The extra weight of the tow plane caused her to approach the ground at 240 kilometers per hour, much faster than usual. The Comet bounced twice and spun 180 degrees on the ground. Luckily, this was a test flight, and the plane had no fuel on board. Otherwise, the crash would have been catastrophic, claiming all of the crew's lives. Emerging from the cockpit with a bloody nose, which later turned out to be broken, Hana immediately began documenting the accident, using a scarf to conceal her injuries from rescuers. Moments later, she lost consciousness. In the hospital, X-rays revealed fractures to her skull in 6 places, a displaced jaw, broken vertebrae, and other severe injuries. Though she survived, not all Comet test pilots were so fortunate. Mano Ziegler, one of the few Comet pilots to survive the war, recalled watching Alois Verndl's first flight with his colleagues. They were chanting, "Make it good, Alois." The pilot took to the sky in a flash. Everything went well until at 6,000 meters, the Comet's engine failed. Attempting to glide back to the airfield, it became clear he was descending too fast. It was not a landing, it was a fall. The plane crashed, flipped, and exploded in a fireball. It was a terrible death, and Mano Ziegler and the pilot's family were only comforted by the fact that it was instant, as there were cases where Comet pilots lost their lives in painful agony. That's a grim reminder of the Comet's lethal design. Wolfgang Später, whom I told you about earlier, had a very good relationship with his colleague, Josef Yoshi Pios. You could even say they were friends. Both the German pilots shared a passion for advanced technology, especially the Comet. On December 30th, 1943, Pios was conducting a routine training flight in a fighter jet. As soon as the plane lifted off the ground, its landing gear struck the fuselage with incredible force. The impact damaged the fuel line, immediately causing the toxic T-stop to leak. The cockpit filled with the acrid stench of fuel. Pios noticed the engine had stopped and realized he needed to return to the base immediately to survive. With all his strength, he directed the damaged aircraft back toward the runway. Suddenly, the wing of the Comet struck a radio antenna. The powerful blow made the plane bounce and then crash nose first into the ground before flipping over. Upside down in the cockpit, Pios tried to free himself, but fuel spilled onto his hands, neck, and head, causing unbearable pain. The mixture began literally dissolving his soft tissues. When Später arrived at the crash site, he first saw Pios' legs sticking out of the wrecked cockpit. Ignoring all safety protocols, he rushed to his friend. But upon seeing Pios' mangled body, Später realized that Yoshi had no chance of survival. However, it wasn't just German pilots who suffered from the corrosive fuel. Ground crews, or black men, servicing the Comet were also at risk. Their task was to refuel the aircraft with its lethal fuel. One day, as a worker was refilling the tank containing remnants of previous fuel, a massive explosion occurred. The blast was so devastating that it not only killed the worker, but also destroyed the entire building where the refueling took place. Rocket liquid fuel has become a problem since its inception. It was so hazardous that it claimed the life of its inventor just years before the first tests of the Comet. In 1930, Max Valier experimented with combining liquid oxygen and kerosene, hoping to create an engine suitable for crewed flight. Max developed a combustion chamber made of steel, through which oxygen and fuel were fed, ignited manually with a blowtorch. During development, Valier personally operated the fuel valves, adjusted pressure, and measured thrust using a simple scale, adding weights to see how much the engine could lift. In short, he worked closely with highly flammable substances without any protective clothing. At the time, safety protocols for such experiments were not well established. On May 17, 1930, during another test, something went wrong. Valier, too engrossed in the process, couldn't react quickly enough when the mixture ignited and the combustion chamber suddenly exploded. The explosion itself didn't severely injure the inventor, but fragments from the chamber scattered, with one piece piercing Valier's pulmonary artery. Despite his colleagues' efforts, he passed away within minutes. This tragedy shocked the global scientific community, but didn't deter further attempts to replicate the powerful fuel of the German fighter jet Comet, even without improving its safety. It turned out to be a grave mistake. When Allied forces captured the Comet, they celebrated the advanced German design, but were cautious about testing the aircraft. Unlike German commanders, they weren't willing to risk their pilots' lives. Flying the Comet wasn't just discouraged, it was strictly forbidden. However, in May 1945, Royal Navy Captain Erich Winkle Brown was eager to experience the speed of the jet-powered model. He arrived at an airfield in Husum and asked the ground crew to prepare the aircraft for a flight. Although they initially refused, Brown signed a waiver absolving the crew of any responsibility for his life. Only then was he allowed to take a test flight. When the Comet took off, Brown was shocked by its incredible acceleration. According to him, it felt like flying in a metal coffin, with survival chances close to zero. Nevertheless, the flight went smoothly, and Erich Brown earned the unofficial title of the only Allied pilot to fly the German Comet. The US decided to create its own version of such a fighter and named it the Bell X-1. They borrowed concepts and ideas from the Me-163, but significantly improved safety by using alcohol-based fuel and liquid oxygen, which were less prone to explosions. The Bell X-1 launched from a carrier plane and could land using conventional landing gear. However, it was not designed for combat missions, but rather for experimental flights to achieve supersonic speeds. In 1943, Japan, Germany's ally, saw potential in the Comet and decided to replicate exactly its unique technology to defend against air raids. But challenges arose immediately. First, Japan paid Germany a significant sum for the license, but struggled to obtain all the necessary components due to submarine blockades. One submarine carrying parts was even sunk. Eventually, they received blueprints and engines, but the Japanese had to adapt them to their own materials, which often did not meet specifications. As a result, during initial tests, the engine exploded. Despite the difficulties, the first flight of the Mitsubishi J8M1 took place on July 7, 1945. Pilot Toyohiko Inuzuka sped down the runway and took off, but the engine soon failed. The plane lost speed, and while the pilot tried to return to the airfield, it crashed into a building. Inuzuka passed away the following day from his injuries. Further tests were temporarily halted due to engine explosions. Although they resolved the fuel system issues, they ran out of time to continue testing. In early August 1945, atomic bombs destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Soon after, Japan surrendered, and the J8M1 project was discontinued, like many other military developments. Modern aircraft no longer use T-Stoff type fuel due to its explosive nature. What's your take? Are such dangerous tests worth the risks in the name of technological progress? Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe to the channel. I've got more fascinating videos about deadly inventions and stories you can't even imagine.